Hello and welcome back to the Ghoul Guides Association. We are, as ever, your Ghoul Guides. I'm Lauren.
And I'm Mary.
And today we are back with a deep dive for you. So this is where we pick a topic that has significance or relevance to Gothic pop culture and history, and we dig into it. We talk about its history, its germination, shall we say, how it became part of the Gothic and how it's relevant today. So our deep dive today is moi. I will be deep diving. And I have told you, Very, what topic I'm deep diving, but I don't think you know much about it.
Also, anyone that knows me knows that I have a terrible memory, so I actually have no idea. Works on times like these. I can be
yes.
fully surprised.
Yeah, it is quite good to be able to surprise you like that. So today we are going to be deep diving the Wild Hunt. Is that something that you are familiar with?
Yes, and I it's all coming back to me now.
Yes, so the Wild Hunt is a folkloric tradition that, particularly in, I would say, maybe the last decade, has become very, very popular in video game, film, and television. But it has had a very strong presence throughout the literary tradition and the artistic tradition of the Gothic. And it also has something that I discovered recently that I did not know. And when I discovered this fact, which I'll talk about later, I was like, oh my God, this makes this so much more Gothic. How did I not know this? And I text Mary and said, I've just learned something and I have to do an episode about it because it relates to something that we did quite recently, actually.
Very,
Okay.
very intriguing.
I know. Intrigue, that's the name of the game. So, what is the Wild Hunt? So, the Wild Hunt is as I said, folkloric tradition, and it is chiefly found in Germanic, Slavic, and Scandinavian nations. And when I say Germanic, I do include places like Russia and Poland that, going back centuries, would have been part of places like Prussia, and then even further back where we have, Balkan tribes and things like that. So we're going back to the Goths and the Gauls and all of those tribal nations that we've talked about in our episodes about Goths and Gothic War. So we're taking it right back to the beginning as ever, which is
one of our favorite things to do. So
yeah, exactly. So this is a literary and folkloric tradition where in the night a horde kind of rampages through a town, a village, a city, and it is some kind of often very violent supernatural force. So, according to Durant and Bailey, and I'm quoting here, in Germanic and Celtic legend, the Wild Hunt consisted of a band of ghosts or spirits who would ride through the night. The hunt was usually led by a divine or semi-divine figure, either female or male, and often a legendary figure such as Herne the Hunter. They go on to say that in Christian Europe during the Middle Ages, it often transformed the female leader of the Wild Hunt into the classical goddess Diana. And in addition, the belief developed that groups of women, instead of spirits of the dead, would ride with Diana. This belief was an important basis for the later notions of night flight and the witches' Sabbath. So this is a tradition that has been connected to witchcraft. It's connected to the undead. Often folklore will say that the Wild Hunt happens around Samhain or Halloween. And in modern neo-paganism, Wicca, things like that, the Wild Hunt has been embraced as almost a positive celebratory force. So it's often a goddess or a mythological figure who, leads this parade of fae spiritual creatures. But it has for a long, long time been quite a violent, supernatural, sometimes even demonic force. But it does have interconnections with the idea of witches coming out at night and witches' revels happening at night. And this is something that Ronald Hutton, who you may remember we mentioned, is a very well respected historian of witchcraft. He's kind of linked these two things together, and he's one of the people who is interested in things like nocturnal ritual fantasy. And he calls them, so the night flight, the witch's sabbath, the wild hunt, he calls them nocturnal processions, which I
Ooh,
really
I
like.
like that.
Yeah, right. But Hutton has noted that in addition to these spirits, fae, that we also get a lot of dead humans. So there's the idea that the undead or the spirits of the undead travel with them. There's this idea as well that if you see the wild hunt, you will be, captured by it. So I think it's probably no surprise that this is a tradition that grew during a period of time where you've got Viking raiders, you've got Germanic tribes people, you've got a lot of invasion, you've got a lot of raiding, having this, group of people who, rush through a village, and if you happen to lay eyes on them, they'll pick you up and carry you away. I think that's it. It feels to me quite clear where this tradition comes from. So
It's all, yeah. I mean, it's also like just on the face of it, there is something inherently horrific about it. In that, like, because I think a lot of times that the wild hunt is depicted, there is this idea that it's an eternal hunt. So once you join it, you can't leave, and that is
yes,
terrifying. Not
yeah,
being
really,
able
really
to
scary.
you lose your individuality, you become part of this bigger
Mm-hmm.
thing,
Mm-hmm.
and then you can't escape it. So yeah,
Yeah.
horrifying.
Yeah, and I think it's inspired. I can think of quite a lot of like fantasy novels and things like that I've read where there's this mysterious, terrifying force of immortal beings that kind of ride through and decimate a place. And obviously, you've got a lot of like pirate folklore, like Davy Jones' Locker and things like that, and the Flying Dutchman, where there's this idea that you can be tied. And some folklorists and scholars have suggested that this is where Tolkien took some of his inspiration
Mm.
for certain aspects of Lord of the Rings. Obviously, you have the undead army that Aragorn summons in Lord of the Rings. And there is this, I'll talk about it a little bit later, there's this idea that knights who sinned or who broke their oath were in the Wild Hunt, that it was almost like a condemnation. And that's kind of what happens in The Return of the King. These knights, these soldiers who went back against their oath, are unable to die because they essentially didn't fulfill their promises. And if you don't know, Tolkien's background was he was a medieval and classical scholar. He was fascinated with folklore, and he was an academic. So I think I agree with that. I think looking back now on Tolkien with the knowledge I have as a Gothicist, I'm like, oh yeah, I can see these bits. And I think there's a bit in the first book where, or it might be The Hobbit, I can't remember if it's Bilbo or Frodo, where they see a hunt like going through the forest. So there's definitely elements to be found in Tolkien.
I think that it's really interesting, and I'm excited to hear you explain more about this. In that you're linking it a lot to witchcraft, because I I think what I'm remembering from the Wild Hunt, where I have come across it in the wild in books and things, is from Cassandra Clare's Mortal Instrument series. But it's connected to to fairies. And you would,
Yeah.
if you joined the hunt, it was like a good thing, but also sometimes a punishment.
Mm-hmm.
And again, you have that idea that once you join it, you can't leave.
Yes,
Which I
exactly.
think is very,
So,
very in that kind of like fairy world, that fey world where everything has like a double edge to it.
yes,
Which,
exactly. And that's a really prominent thing in Fae folklore, particularly in Gaelic folklore and in Welsh folklore, this idea that you cannot exist between the realms. You either, if you go into the Fae realm and you partake of food and things like that, then you get trapped. You get to be immortal, but you also are kind of trapped there forever. So yes, there is definitely a connection between witchcraft and the Wild Hunt, between the Fae and the Wild Hunt, between the undead and the Wild Hunt, and we'll see as we go on quite a lot of the monsters that appear in the Gothic. So, what are the features of the Wild Hunt? Now, it does depend on which tradition you are looking at. And scholars such as Hutton, folklorists, have basically looked at all of these different traditions. Some have shared features, some don't, and it does seem to depend on how the myth sort of travelled through, and the region that it's set in, if that makes sense. So we have Scandinavian, so Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, and I should have written, I just put Scandinavian, but they all have a version of the Wild Hunt. Germany, Poland, and areas of the Balkans all have their own. It's quite popular in Slavic mythology. It's present in Britain and differs between England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, with Ireland, England, and Wales are each having their very own specific ones. The Scottish tradition is slightly different because we do have figures like the Nick Nethen and the Caliac. I hope I've said that right. Apologies if I haven't. But yeah, it basically all across Europe, we have this image of the Wild Hunt. So one of the most popular features of the Wild Hunt, in addition to spirits, ghouls, dead soldiers, violent tyrants, legendary figures, is the presence of dogs and wolves. So the Wild Hunt often is either heralded by the barking and the howling of dogs and wolves, and they're often the forerunners. And I think that, again, makes a lot of sense, because if you were living in a rural Germanic village in the 5th century, you actually were very, very much at risk from wolves. And that lasted right up until, in some areas, the 18th and 19th centuries, before they became overhunted and in many cases are now either no longer native or extinct. But also, I think, makes a lot of sense because we often joke about this with cryptids, but we know that rabid dogs are often mistaken for cryptids. So I think this idea of you're sleeping in your bed and you hear a pack of dogs or a pack of wolves and the stamping of hooves, I think there's a very primal fear there, and I think the Wild Hunt picks up on a lot of that.
I think also some people don't realize how big wolves are. They're not
Oh my god, they're
just
fucking huge.
they're not just like big dogs. Like they're
Yeah,
really really like ginormous like compared to dogs.
yeah.
So like if you
I
imagine
was,
like a pack of wolves like
yeah.
running through your village, it would be very very scary and very loud. So
Yes,
yeah.
exactly. I mean, we were talking about this the other day because I was telling you, wasn't I, about my cousins had one of those big wolf dogs, and I can't remember exactly which breed it was, but similar to a husky. And as a child, they used to put me on the back of the dog, and I would ride the dog as a toddler. But that's a dog. Like, that is a domesticated version. Yes, more closely related to wolves than, say, a chihuahua. But that was still a domesticated version, and that was a fucking massive dog. So wolves are huge, very loud, obviously very violent, very destructive. A wolf can kill a human quite easily. And interestingly, in Germany, the Wild Hunt was often accompanied by werewolves.
Of course.
Of course. So I didn't have the time to kind of really dig into this, and I suspect there is probably research on this, but when I was looking for like Wild Hunt and werewolves, it was just kind of like, oh yeah, werewolves are often accompanying the Wild Hunt. It's mostly a Germanic tradition. But I suspect that this is probably because, particularly in France and Germany, werewolves were a particular fear in the Middle Ages. You have things like the Beast of Gévaudan, which is a medieval French, I'm going to say panic. It wasn't a moral panic. It was more like something like the Dancing Plagues. There was almost certainly one or more very violent, very big wolves that were very, very hungry and were attacking people in these idyllic pastoral scenes that were seen to have been safe. But this gave rise to a lot of fear around werewolves. And obviously, we know from things like Little Red Riding Hood, which mostly has its origins in the Germanic language, that wolves and this idea of men turning into wolves and the way that that would, attack a village or ravage a village was a very real fear up until the Enlightenment, really, as with most things.
Well,
The
it's one
Enlightenment
of
just
those.
got rid of everything fun.
It's one of those things where often, you might hear them at night, and then you'd come out, and then there
Mm-hmm.
might be a sheep or multiple sheep's
Mm-hmm.
dead, and or like you said, like a human killed, and you might see no
Mm-hmm.
evidence other than maybe footprints, and if you, or you might have caught glances of this thing, but they're
Mm-hmm.
so much bigger than normal dogs, that I think it doesn't, it doesn't surprise me that people would, think, oh, werewolf, obviously, because
Yeah.
we can't explain this fully, and there's some mystery to it, so werewolf.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think it makes a lot of sense as well that werewolves are connected to the Wild Hunt. If we've got this idea that, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but this idea that seeing the Wild Hunt would either be a portent of death or you would be taken into the Wild Hunt. Werewolves have, more so than the other Gothic classic monsters like vampires, have always had this kind of anxiety and tension around them about them blurring the boundary between the human and the supernatural, because it's not a transformation in the permanent state necessarily, at least in most folklores. So I think it makes a lot of sense that in particular werewolves would be something that the Wild Hunt would have with it. But as I said, also spirits, ghouls, sometimes fae, sometimes elves. And it's always led by some kind of deity or half deity. And as I mentioned, this could be both male and female. And in a lot of traditions that I came across, it seemed like there would often be either a couple or kind of twin god and goddesses. So one that represented one aspect and one that represented another. So it seems to have always been male and female deities. But as Christianity came into play, the female of it seems to have slipped a little bit. But I think that's where the witchcraft of it all came in. This idea that the Wild Hunt had some kind of, and they are often goddesses that we would kind of connect to night, to darkness, but also to magic and to the supernatural and the idea of there being perhaps other realms. So I think it does make sense. Hutton says that there actually is less evidence than we would think that the Wild Hunt and the belief in the Wild Hunt had any impact on things like witch trials in the later medieval and into the kind of like early modern period. But I think the fact that in the earlier traditions, it seems like there was always a masculine and a feminine deity. I think that's a really interesting dichotomy and probably led to that connection to witchcraft.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense, because I think one of the things that patriarchal religions and monotheisms like Christianity do is to try and downplay women and women's
Exactly.
roles. So it's like, no, obviously there wouldn't have been like a female deity. It was just men. And
Yeah.
also because like a hunt sounds very masculine. I
Mm-hmm.
think that's why in a lot of the later witch trials it makes more sense. They're focused on
Yeah.
familiars that are smaller animals, cats, toads, mice,
Mm-hmm.
rabbits, all these
Mm-hmm.
kinds of things,
Mm-hmm.
not wolves, and definitely not something that's like, a masculine hunt. So I
Yes,
mean, this is all just,
absolutely.
I have no evidence or research to back this up. This is all just my opinion. But yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And it does seem like, so from what I can tell, the hunt was always in some way militaristic, but it wasn't always solely militaristic.
But
And it
again,
seems,
sorry, just to back up my whole like
mm,
patriarchal monotheistic point, in that if you go back to Roman mythology, Greek mythology and even Norse mythology, like there are women gods that are gods of specific, archery especially. Like it was, there were women deities who would be part of that kind of,
Yeah.
heavenly military, as it were. So I think that like the move towards monotheism and
Yeah.
specifically patriarchal interpretations of monotheism
Yeah.
has dulled that down, but it is there.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, with war, it was more about like war was never homogenous in the classical period. Athena was the god of war in the sense of strategy, and Mars was the god of war. I've just mixed up my pantheons, but was the god of war in terms of like the violence and the rage of war. Ares, that's who I'm thinking of. And the same with, Diana was, the goddess of the hunt and still had aspects of war and military. So, it was these different aspects, and war in the classical period, despite still being quite patriarchal, was imagined as having these masculine and feminine aspects to it. But what's interesting about the Wild Hunt is that there is these militaristic essence to it, and there is this kind of fear and this monstrousness, but then you also have the fae and the sublime and the otherworldliness of it all. And it does seem to depend on the traditions, and there is a clear distinction when Christianity starts to become popular. But traditionally, the hunt was almost always led by Odin, or more specifically in this case, his Germanic version, Woden or Wotan, which is the sort of British Germanic version, I believe, of Odin. So again, this is not my strong suit, but as I understand it from my studies in terms of, tracing the Goths and figuring them out, there was a lot of overlap between the Norse religions and the Germanic tribal religions. So there's a big sort of like interplay between Germanic mythology and pre-Christian mythology or early Christian mythology, because it's still the kind of pagan, and Nordic mythology. But we tend to only really think of the Nordic. But I guess a good example would be some of the German operas, like I'm not going to attempt to say any of them, but some of the 19th century and early 20th century operas that focus on these myths and these legends use the Germanic versions of gods and deities like Woden. There are obviously differences, there are their own traditions, but there's shared lineages. And this is why Odin is so popular as a god and why he's so powerful in something like American Gods, because there's so many versions of Odin. Because of the way that those religions intermapped against each other and the movement between peoples, Odin is one of those deities who has so many different forms. Even within the Norse tradition, he has like 4 different identities. And then you've also got Woden, you've also got Wotan, like you have all these different identities of Odin. So the hunt is most traditionally led by Odin. So if you don't know who Odin is, he is the father of the Norse gods. He is generally seen as being the kind of supreme god of thunder. He is the father of Law and of Law. He's the father of Thor and the adoptive father of Loki. He is married to Frigga or Freya, who is the goddess of kind of like life and women. So he is a father god in the same way as someone like Zeus or Jupiter. And all of those are also kind of like thunder and lightning gods. So you can kind of see the connections there. But he's not the only person who leads the Wild Hunt. In Wales, the Wild Hunt is led by, and I've checked this pronunciation, so I hope I get this right, Gwyn ap Nudd, who in the Welsh tradition is the king of the fairy folk and is also the ruler of the otherworld. So in the Celtic tradition and the Welsh tradition, and I think the Gaelic tradition, there is this parallel plane of existence. So if you're a Dungeons and Dragons fan, this is where the idea of something like the Feywild comes from. And obviously this exists in lots of different traditions, but Welsh folklore and mythology has been mined by fantasy writers and fantasy game creators for nearly a century, if not more now. Welsh mythology is very, very popular as a sort of basis for fantasy world building. But in the Welsh tradition, there is this place called the Otherworld, and that's where the fairy folk live. And Gwyn ap Nith is the kind of like the ruler. So that's where you're getting that fairy connection explicitly in the Welsh tradition. And also in the Irish tradition, because in the Irish tradition, the deity Nuada, who I would say is probably like a parallel to Gwyn ap Nudd. Nuada is another sort of ruler deity who has this fae aspect to them. In the Irish tradition, Nuada is the one that leads the Wild Hunt. Now, in Britain, more broadly, and when I say Britain, I am, of course, actually talking about England then colonising and attempting to homogenise our neighbouring nations, it's led by a couple of different people, some of whom might surprise you. So, the most famous leader of the Wild Hunt in the English tradition is Herne the Hunter, who is a quite famous mythological figure. He is a ghostly, spectral huntsman who is said to have a stag's antlers that grow from his head. And
I mean,
he...
I was just going to say, like, before you mentioned, like, the English traditions, I was like, it's actually really refreshing that we're focusing on, like, Celtic and Gaelic and, like, Welsh traditions, and it's so nice as someone, like, who is English and is aware that, like, so much of, like, what we call British is just English, and would like to know more about, like, our neighbouring countries and traditions, and think that they're really cool. I was like, this is great. I love this. And then you're like, oh, Herne the Hunter, and I'm like, oh, I really want to not like him, but he, like, having antlers on your head,
He's a bad bitch.
that's kind of cool.
He's a
But
spectral huntsman.
yeah, but
antlers.
like no shade to all of the other traditions, because like I thought they were all sounded really, really cool, and I love the fact that like Welsh kind of like folklore has such a prominent kind of position like globally. That's amazing.
Yes,
but yeah,
absolutely.
sorry, back to this.
Back to Herne the Huntsman. I mean, I have to say, some of the leaders of the Wild Hunt, you know, they rival in Mothman for my supernatural boyfriend moniker, you know?
How do you think that it works? Do you think that maybe they'd like take shifts? Like, I'll do like you know, a couple of weeks and then we'll swap. Like,
I wondered that, or I wondered if it's like
Wild Hunt rota.
Well, I wondered if it's a little bit like, you know, we all have our different militaries. Is it like, you know, Herne the Huntsman is the English Wild. He leads the English Wild Hunt, and occasionally maybe he links up with Gwyn ap Nudd and they do a little tour of Wales together. But then you've got Odin over in Scandinavia, and then sometimes he puts on his little Woden mustache and he goes over to Germany. Or I wonder if it's a little bit like in something like American Gods, where it's like they're all the same person, but they're all the different versions of themselves. You know, maybe it's like that, or maybe they're all like alters of each other. I like to imagine that there's like, you know, different wild hunts in each country, and it's a little bit like when you do like cultural festivals and you're like, you know, our version of the Morris dance is this. You know, I like to think maybe they have like supernatural Olympics or something, and they like compete against each other. I think that would be pretty cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, Herne the Hunter sounds like a badass. What is it about stag antlers from like a human head that is just so fucking cool?
I don't know. I don't know, but it is. Yeah, I'm with you on that.
It's just really fucking cool. So Herne the Hunter is a very famous English folkloric figure, and he is mostly said to haunt Windsor Forest and the Great Park down in Berkshire. So
Windsor Forest near Windsor Castle.
Yeah.
Okay.
I wonder who he's coming for.
No comment from me.
But another figure, and I would argue that this is one of the ones that actually is British and not English, because the existence of this figure in English folklore does explicitly come from at least Welsh, if not also Scottish folklore, is King Arthur.
Okay. Cool.
So King Arthur is also often imagined as one of the leaders of the Wild Hunt. If you don't know, there's a lot of mythology around King Arthur having either a second coming, because in later Christian traditions he was sort of, I mean, King Arthur is a weird myth. There is an older Welsh tradition for him before it gets co-opted into the British tradition. But he is always kind of an explicitly Christian figure in England, but he is a more pagan figure in maybe Wales. But there's this whole thing about the once and future king with Arthur, and I think, yeah, it makes sense that you would think that a potentially magical king who was fated to return might lead something like a supernatural
I mean,
horde.
he's besties with Merlin. Like Merlin
Right?
is like, you know, the kind of like the wizard of all wizards. So
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
sure, why not put him in
And
a
Merlin
hunt?
is Merlin comes from the Welsh character. I think it's Merthin. Mary knows this. Eventually I'll do an episode. I was obsessed with Arthurian legends as a teenager. That was my undiagnosed autistic preteen fixation. We all had one. Mine was Arthurian legends,
Hey,
and
no judgment.
I read a series of books that were not age appropriate for me, and I became really, really obsessed. I made my parents take me to Tintagel, which I live in Nottingham. It's really fucking far from Cornwall. I was like, I want to go to Tintagel. I need to see where King Arthur was born. Like 14.
I love that. I love that for you.
There is one other person in the British tradition that is said to lead the Wild Hunt, and I think you're going to be really surprised and maybe a little bit confused when I tell you who this person is.
Okay.
So,
yeah, I am. Well, yeah.
in a
Awaiting with
later bated breath.
yes, yeah.
So, in a later legend that is mostly from Dartmoor, which a lot of our best legends come from Dartmoor, the Wild Hunt was said to have been led by the explorer, privateer, and politician and potential spy, Sir Francis Drake.
Yeah, no, that's fake. I know. No, can't get on board with that
Denied.
one. Sorry, no. Sounds fake. Definitely made up by his publicists. Why?
I mean, honestly, I'm not sure. I couldn't work out exactly why. I think it's because
that's bizarre.
Obviously, yeah, it is bizarre. And I was like confused, because I was like, it's before things like the Hellfire Club, but Drake was quite entwined in some of the darker dealings of Elizabethan politics. He was also famously a fucking colonist, so probably did wreak quite a lot of violence. But yeah, he's not someone who I would have necessarily thought of as being like the leader of the Wild Hunt. Like, he had quite an infamous reputation as a privateer. Like, the Spanish made up all sorts of stories and legends about him, and he was, sort of like I think they called him like the Drac, like El Drac or something like that, and he was quite a notorious figure, and he was a bit of a swashbuckler, but like, the man literally died shitting himself after a failed expedition. Not to make light of dysentery, it's a terrible disease.
Yeah.
But like, I could not really work out why specifically it was led by Sir Francis Drake. And that's quite late. Like, that legend must be 16th century onwards. That's quite late, isn't it, for like a
I always think it's really interesting to think, like, what are the kind of legends that are going to emerge from like our period, and like if we like skip ahead like 200 300 years, obviously, like, unless the world has been obliterated by the climate apocalypse, but like if there is still like, a functioning humanity,
Mm-hmm.
who else is going to be leader of the
Yeah.
wild
The
hunt,
Wild Hunt. Probably Elon
but
Musk. They probably drive Teslas and Cybertrucks.
oh god.
No, the
Yeah,
Wild Hunt is way too cool for Elon
I
Musk.
know. Yeah.
So traditionally, and in older folklore, even in the earlier sort of like more fae and supernatural iterations of the Wild Hunt, it almost always heralded disaster. Usually it was kind of like a portent of plague, war, or famine. And it was said to either abduct those who witnessed it and, co-opt them into the hunt, or it would mark you for death. So it was like kind of that horrible thing. It's not like you saw the Wild Hunt and it was so horrific you died. It was like you're going to die soon, which is infinitely scarier because you've seen it. And there's this kind of, a lot of the sort of fear around the Wild Hunt and the way that it's been used in a lot of fantasy is that idea of you can hear it outside, and perhaps it's almost like that temptation to look out the window, but knowing that if you look upon it, something terrible is going to happen to you. So
Yeah.
it does have connections with other traditions, as I will talk about in a moment. But in modernity, Wiccans, as I mentioned, have adapted it. And it is something that's celebrated around Halloween. And in the Wiccan tradition, the leader is Hecate or Hecate, the Greco-Roman goddess of witchcraft and magic, who we talked about in our witches episode. So again, it's one of those areas in folklore that in neo-paganism and in modern witchcraft, it has taken on a slightly different approach, but it has a very interesting history, and Ronald Hutton has a really great article about this, which I can link in the show notes. But if you Google the Wild Hunt and the Witch's Sabbath, you'll find it, and you can probably read it for free on JSTOR. And he does a really great sort of like look at the evolution of the myth and the folklore around it, and how, like everything Gothic, it kind of adapted and evolved to each period and took on more qualities. And on that note of the Gothic, one of the leaders of the Wild Hunt is somebody who we are quite familiar with and who I mentioned in a recent episode. Now, I have to say, this was more difficult to research, and in the academic texts that I looked at, I didn't find mention of this person. However, it's entirely possible that's because I was reading stuff published in English, and generally, English-speaking scholars are a lot more interested in Germanic folklore traditions, and in like the Norse Eddas and things like that, than say Italian folklore traditions. So in Italy, apparently, the leader of the Wild Hunt is none other than Visigoth badman himself, Theodoric the Great.
I mean, that makes sense. That makes
Right?
sense. Yeah, yeah. Like,
So
I was kind of thinking, like, have we mentioned any of the popes? Because that would be really funny. But no, it makes more sense that it is
yes. Yeah.
Theodoric.
So if you remember from our Gothic Wars episode, Theodoric was a Visigoth king, who was an absolute violent bastard. And the reason he's called Theodoric the Great is because he won so many wars and killed so many people. But he was the one that really established the Goths in northern Italy, particularly in the city of Ravenna. An infamous and famous king, fits both titles. Though this does seem less well documented than the other leaders of the hunt, so I kind of hesitated, but it makes a lot of sense because Theodoric was regarded by the early church and what would become the Orthodox and the Catholic Church as a heretic. As we discussed in our Gothic War episode, the Visigoths were Arians, and by the Byzantine Empire, and of course this is why the Goths fought with Justinian, their brand of Christianity was not the Orthodox brand of Christianity. They were seen as being heretics. And Theodoric famously killed a guy whose name I am going to get right, but a saint, maybe you will know him. His name was Boethius. Boethius? Boethius. Another one I struggled with
Yeah.
the pronunciation of. But yeah, basically he was a kind of an early evangelist for the Orthodox brand of Christianity, and Theodoric imprisoned him because he was not getting on very well with the empire at that point, and then he tortured him, and then he murdered him, and of course made him a martyr. So this happened in 524, and I suppose I was thinking about it as like, okay, so this is a guy who is essentially is heretical. He is incredibly violent. He is a invader. He does, horrific tortures to people. He, invades. He is, an incredibly violent person, but also he's a goth. So he's the antithesis of civilization. He's the antithesis of Rome. And he's arguably, after Alaric, like the greatest of all the Goths. So it kind of makes sense that in Italy, potentially, particularly in northern Italy, Theodoric would be the leader of the Wild Hunt. Because
Yeah.
that's a hell of a legacy.
Yeah, and it's like, this guy was so great, or perhaps not so great, but also like he did a lot of stuff. So like,
Mhm.
what can we, like, where can we put him posthumously? Why not leading the Wild Hunt, where he can carry, his legacy can be to carry on leading that.
Exactly. I've just realised I've been saying Visigoth and I meant Ostrogoth. I'm very sorry, listeners. I do know my Goths, but it does get a little bit confusing. Theodoric was the Ostrogoth king, and I think I specifically said we always talk about the Visigoths, so let's talk about the Ostrogoths in that episode. So one thing that I did not know, probably because my research has only ever been into the actual historical events of the Gothic tribes and how that then became imagined in the Gothic tradition. I never knew this, but I have discovered in my research for this episode, one of the reasons it seems that Theodoric has been imagined as a leader of the Wild Hunt is not just because he was essentially a tyrant. It's also because in the Germanic heroic tradition, he has a legendary heroic alter ego, essentially. So the Wild Hunt is sometimes led by these legendary mythological heroic figures like King Arthur. Sigurd the Dragon Slayer is also often depicted leading the Wild Hunt. And Theodoric's altar, essentially, his legend, his version and legend, is a guy called Dietrich von Bern. Dietrich means ruler of the people, and it basically is a form of Theodoric. So Dietrich and Theodoric are kind of the same name, if that makes sense. And in the legends, in the heroic legends, Dietrich was the ruler of Verona. So again, a Germanic king ruling from Italy. So I never knew this, but essentially this figure Dietrich von Bern is similar to someone like Sigurd or Ossian, or I'm trying to think of any of the other ones, but even maybe like a Thor. If you think about the heroic figures of like the Edda that we have in the European tradition, there is a hero, usually some kind of demigod. Think about someone like Hercules, but it's very popular in the Celtic, Germanic, Gallic tradition. So it makes sense that it's the same in the Germanic. But I didn't realize that this was still sort of like developing around this time. So Dietrich is Theodoric's legendary alter ego, essentially. And these legends about Theodoric cropped up pretty soon after his death. One of the earliest ones they can date is 526. And these legends made their way across the country. They have found statues in Scandinavia with poems about Theodoric / Dietrich and him, riding through and his kind of essentially being a figure like the Wild Huntsman. And a lot of these legends, they sort of take historical battles from Theodoric's life. And this really fascinated me. Instead of being a fight against the Eastern or Western Roman Empire, it's against dwarves and dragons and giants. And Dietrich develops mythological attributes such as, breathing fire or having magic. As we mentioned multiple times across this show, the Gothic originates as a literary tradition, as an allegorical, representation of real events. So in the 1760s, Richard Herd is like, oh, we shouldn't be so dismissive of the medieval because these legends of giants and dragons are actually allegories for feudal lords and things like that. So what's really fascinating is this Gothic king was turned into
Yeah.
essentially a medieval romance. And his actual real life exploits were reimagined as these supernatural goings on. So it's this weird sort of like, I don't even know how to describe it. Like, it's a mirror mirroring a mirror by the end of it.
It's like a harmony,
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So yeah, essentially, so I'm kind of paraphrasing here a little bit because this is where it gets things I don't, theological terms I don't fully understand. But there's this idea that Dietrich takes on this kind of like mythological, supernatural abilities and sometimes demonic attributes. So Dietrich is often presented as being almost demonic, is because Theodoric, being Arian, would have burned in hell essentially. And basically there is this story that Gregory the Great writes that says Theodoric's soul, and this is very the monk, was dragged away and dropped into Mount Etna, where he would burn as punishment for his crimes against Orthodox Christians.
It's so fascinating, isn't it, that like we often don't really learn this part of history, because when we learn about this period in England, at least, it's like, here's the Greeks and Romans, and then let's skip forward to like Henry VIII and stuff. You don't really learn about the Goths, and it's like, here's this guy who was like so influential that after he died, a kind of alter ego of him was constructed, and then it's like, it's turned into, like you say, like this Gothic romance, and like, like it's wild. Like,
Well,
and then also, like, part of his story, like, he's dropped into Mount Etna.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, that's badass in terms of like a story. Like, like, okay, can someone make this into a film or like write the book?
Yes, what's really interesting is, so you have like the 6th century, Theodoric dies, and you have this immediate sort of legendization, shall we say, of him, and this creation of the character of Dietrich, who is a heroic character but has these demonic aspects. And then as we get towards the like 11th, 12th century, you have stories starting to kind of appear where Theodoric takes on actual supernatural qualities himself, so separate from Dietrich. So Theodoric, there's a story about him riding to hell on an infernal horse while still alive. So no wonder he became one of the leaders of the Wild Hunt, if that was a story about him. Other traditions also suggested that he was the son of the devil, or that he had made some kind of pact with a demon, which is giving Vlad the Impaler Dracula. But just, I had no idea, and I thought it was really fascinating that one of the guys who, yes, Theodoric is not the king who, quote unquote, brings down the Roman Empire, but he is the greatest and the most famous of the Gothic kings, and arguably the one who was the biggest thorn in the side of the what was by then the Roman Empire. He was a huge problem for the Byzantine Empire because he was sometimes friend, sometimes enemy. He was incredibly unpredictable. He was a great strategist. He was an incredibly skilled warrior, and his men fought very hard for him. He was not a man you wanted to cross. But then, yeah, that Gothic becomes this synonym for barbarous, that then in the 12th and 13th century, because of medieval art in the 16th century, looking back, becomes a synonym for all of the supernatural things. And actually, in the more broad European tradition, Theodoric himself became part of that supernatural tradition. And then we call the literary genre the Gothic in the 18th century.
Yeah.
I have never, in all of my years as a Gothicist, all of my conferences, I had never come across this. And it just fascinated me that whether or not this was a late medieval Christian demonization of him, or whether or not it was a sort of canonization of earlier demonizations, that Theodoric became this sort of like infernal tyrant, but also has this slightly complicated heroic alter ego who is in stories that we would consider to be essentially like chivalric romances. Wow.
So, like, should we start a campaign of like justice for Theodoric, which isn't to like be like we think he's like cool
We think Slaughter is great.
and someone that we should idolize, but that his story is really cool, and maybe we should like dramatize some of his legendary aspects because it would make a good
It would make an
book or
amazing
film.
You know what would be a really amazing one would be one of those where, and they've done this with Arthur before, where it's like you've got the the real Theodoric, maybe an undead version of him, or like his maybe it's Athasantha, the Gothic queen that I was
Yes.
like, she's
Yeah,
a
yeah,
bad
yeah.
bitch. Maybe it's her being like, he wasn't like that. But I love the idea of it being like, here's the myth, the myth that's grown, and then it's like, here's what's really happened. Because both stories are pretty insane. Like some
Yeah.
of the tactics, I didn't go into this because really the Gothic Wars was less about Theodoric and more about the clusterfuck that happened because his heir died, and then he died. But the tactics he used were fucking insane. Like brutal, but also just a lot of the ways that he won was because people just didn't expect him to do such insane, horrific things, which kind of again makes sense that if you're in Italy and you're like, oh yeah, there's this guy who rides in with this horde and all of these terrible things happen, of course it's going to be Theodoric. So yeah, not only one of the progenitors of the Gothic tradition, but also literally the originator in some cases of some of this idea of him riding to hell on an infernal steed. That's badass as fuck. Let's make this film.
Yeah.
So we've got the features of the Wild Hunt, we've got, the leaders of the Wild Hunt, but where does it actually come from and how has it kind of evolved into the tradition we know today? So interestingly, according to Hutton, there is almost no real tradition in the Greco-Roman and in the classical of a nocturnal procession. So you obviously do have like Dionysian rites and you have festivals of Hecate and you have cult religions, but this idea of a nocturnal tradition, a nocturnal procession seems to have been a specifically Germanic tradition, and it's the Germanic tradition that then passed into the Celtic Gaelic tradition and into the Scandinavian tradition. Because if you think about the Angles, the Saxons, they're all peoples coming out of Germany and spreading west towards Britain. So it does make sense that they're the origin of the folklore. So it seems like the Wild Hunt actually, and I was really fascinated by this because I've always thought about the Wild Hunt as a Scandinavian tradition. I'd only ever really thought of it in terms of the Norse tradition, and that's because I'm a Marvel Comics girl, and I'll say this at the end, but it appears in some of the Thor comics. But it actually seems like it was originally a Germanic tradition, and he wonders if this is because of some of the Germanic tribes. So Tacitus, one of the Roman historians, describes one of the Germanic tribes painting themselves all in black in the hopes that their enemies would mistake them as an army of, deadly, ghostly spectres. So he kind of posits this idea that it comes out of actual military tradition, and that they did this. I will say I put a little bit of a maybe on that, because we do know that, like, with things like woad and body painting, what we thought certain pre-Christian tribes did is maybe not as accurate as we think it is. But I do think if the Romans thought that's what the Germans were doing, and that's what the Goths and other tribes people were doing, then that makes a lot of sense where this would come from. So Husson basically suggests that it starts in the Germanic tradition, and then as the Germanic tribes start to spread because of the invasion of the Huns, which is why they end up in Italy, it's why they end up in other parts of Europe, it's why the Angles and the Saxons end up in England, and then obviously their folklore interacts with existing Gaelic and Celtic folklore. Essentially it starts to grow, and that's where it starts to take on the Fae aspects and this idea of Odin or Woden. But as Christianity starts to spread and dominate Europe, so we're talking more sort of like 5th century onwards, we're not talking about that first sort of like 5 centuries post-Christian, we're talking more about the second half, when it starts to become the dominant religion across Europe, and we start to get those Christian dynasties like the Normans, like the Franks, so on and so forth. So again, probably, like I said with the Gothic Wars, probably like a post-Charlemagne thing, when we start to get more homogeneity across Europe in terms of Christian dynasties. This is when the demonic entities start to happen. So the demonic and the horror aspects of the Wild Hunt come alongside Christianity, which is really interesting when you think about something like nocturnal ritual fantasy and this idea of the demonic in the nighttime. In the Middle Ages, particularly in like the 11th and 12th century, you get a lot of stories of like hosts of demons and the terrors of the night. You do get some earlier, though. Our old friend, whose name I can't say, Prosopius or Procopius, who I called P in the God War episode, he does report a myth from the west coast of Gaul, where he talks about like invisible companies of the dead. So very Tolkien's dead armies. And there's this whole thing about them getting on boats and going across to Britain, and that being like the journey to the other world. And that is quite a common thing. There was a lot of this idea that the outskirts of Britain were where you went, there was this other world, and that's what it's called in the Celtic, particularly the Welsh tradition, which is quite interesting. But it does seem to really solidify in the 11th and 12th century. That's when you get Norman priests telling stories of processions of the dead, demons, giants, all of these kind of monstrous creatures. And there is this kind of aspect.
It makes sense when you have it as more of the kind of an empire, because it was a way for the kind of colonization to be like, okay, so these are your stories, or these are stories you might be familiar with, or these are stories that like we can use, and we're gonna incorporate them, but like they're bad, like there's nothing good, because obviously like what we're selling is the best, and it's it's the light, and everything else is relegated to the darkness and the demonic, and
exactly.
It's bad.
And this is where it does become more expressly militaristic. So there's a lot of focus in these Norman stories, particularly this guy called Vitalis, about like armored knights in the procession. And there's a real focus on this idea that the reason they're in the hunt or in the nocturnal procession is because they have sinned and they have committed terrible acts. And this idea that, essentially it's some kind of infernal punishment. And as we get into what I would consider like the chivalric feature, this story of like sinner knights becomes really popular in terms of these nocturnal processions in the Wild Hunt. And to me, that makes a lot of sense because this is the era of the Crusades. You have all of these men going off to fight in armor in far off lands. You have people coming back. And you know, how do you recognize someone who's been off at war for 10 years? How do you know he is who he says he is? But also you've got stories like the Knights Templar. You've got this idea of corruption between the Knights' orders and that they've been exposed to terrible things in the Holy Land. And there is this crossover at this time between Christianity and magic in a lot more of a sense. You know, the Templars, there were all these tales about black magic and things like that. And they're not the only order who came under scrutiny in this way. So I think, from my perspective, it makes sense that this is when the hunt starts to feature more soldiers. And essentially, as it evolves, you get this idea of knights. So this chronicler, a German chronicler in 1123, Eckhard von Ora, writes about a host of dead knights roaming the province of Worms, tortured by their sins, by red hot arms and armor. And the idea was that the people had to pray for them. So it does seem like, as with a lot of things in this kind of like 10th to 14th century Christianity in Europe, it was used as a way, like nocturnal ritual fantasy, to get people to pray. So it was like, oh, well, if you pray for the tortured souls of the hunt, then they might be able to like be absolved of their sins and move on, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I thought
The
that was
power
really
of
interesting
prayer.
as well. Yeah, absolutely. Around this time, you also get more kings appearing. So in one case, you get a British king called Hurler, who was doomed to roam with his mounted retinue for centuries, never aging because of a spell placed on them by a demonic dwarf. I'm quoting from Hutton there. I thought that was really interesting because you know who fucking loves a demonic dwarf? Mary Shelley.
Yeah, she does.
So both in Transformations and in Valpurga, for some reason, you have like a weird demonic dwarf. It's especially odd in Valpurga. It's never really explained. But demonic dwarves and dwarves in general are a really popular part of Germanic folklore. One of the, I think it's the ring cycle. There's this whole thing about the dwarf. I think his name is Albrecht. So it makes sense again that in the English tradition there'd be demonic dwarves because it definitely comes from the Germanic tradition. And what is also really fascinating is around the time of the 12th and 13th century, so we're looking at things like the plague, the dead and the idea of the dead being doomed to wander the earth and the undead appearing becomes more established as part of the tradition. And that made me think of something else that happened around the same time that has the dead rolling into town. Do you know what I might be talking about?
Are you talking about just Dance Macabre or like?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay, cool.
Yeah, so it's always reminded me of it, but it does seem like this addition of the dead. Hutton suggests it's always been there, but becomes a more prominent feature around the same time that the Dance of Death and this idea of, things like the Pied Piper coming into town, like it does seem to have been parallel to those sort of memento mori traditions.
That's
So
so
basically,
interesting.
isn't it? And
Yeah.
again, as Dance Macabre, however you want to pronounce it, hugely influential on the Gothic. Particularly the kind of Gothic in revenge tragedy and things like that. Massively influential. So yeah, I think it's really interesting to see these kind of parallels between it. So over the centuries, the Wild Hunt changes, it adapts, it adds additional members to the horde, including, for some reason, Francis Drake. And of course, when you've got the popularity of the chivalric romances, it's kind of no wonder, particularly to me from a nationalistic perspective, that King Arthur becomes attached to the Wild Hunt. I mean, that man gets everywhere. Search for the Holy Grail, King Arthur. The Wild Hunt, King Arthur. Like, we do
Again,
like to
though,
put him in all of the myths.
but he's besties with Merlin, so it makes sense.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it eventually evolves. By about the 15th century, in mainly France and England, it starts to die out, apart from sort of more local legends. But it doesn't in Germany, which means that if we're thinking about sort of 15th, 16th century, that would include some Slavic nations, what would become Prussia. So again, places like Poland, some aspects and areas of Russia, but it does seem to have died out in sort of like France and in England, which is really fascinating. So it didn't have an impact on the witch trials, which you would think it would have done. But Hutton suggests in his article that there's no real link between the witch trials, despite the fact that witches' Sabbaths were often used as an accusation. The Wild Hunt and its mythology doesn't seem to have come up anywhere, which I thought was really fascinating, because I had assumed, again, that something like this would have been a big part of the witch hunt. But I wonder if maybe it was a bit too out there and a little bit too pagan
Yeah.
by the
Yeah.
15th and 16th century. I think in the earlier, like the 12th and 13th century, where we do have a lot of more sort of like this idea of demons being present and things like that, I think it kind of makes sense that it does separate from witchcraft at this point. But yeah, that was really fascinating, that I thought it would have a big influence. But yeah, long before the Reformation, it actually sort of died out, apart from in the more German-speaking lands, which I didn't expect. So, where and why do we know about the Wild Hunt today?
Excellent
Now,
question.
this is also something that I didn't know, and I was super shocked to learn this, but then I was like, why are you shocked? It makes so much sense. Guess who put all of the different myths from around Europe together to create a single book about the Wild Hunt? Well, it's not all about the Wild Hunt, but it's included in there.
Okay, please tell me.
Jacob Grimm, elder of the
Oh,
Grimm
yeah.
brothers.
Oh, yeah. No, that makes sense. Sorry. Yeah, I was like, who could it be? And then it's like, oh, yeah,
Who could it be?
obviously
Yeah.
it's one of the two brothers who like basically dedicated their lives to like collecting stories in and around the Germanic region.
Exactly. So yeah, the Wild Hunt is in a lot
Yeah.
of ways a Grimm fairy tale. It's literally a Grimm tale. So in 1835, Jacob, the older of the Grimm brothers, published the I wrote down the pronunciation, but I'm still going to get this wrong. The Deutsche Mythology. That is not how you enunciate, I'm fairly sure, but I
Yeah.
don't speak German.
The Deutsch mythology. We can say it with a
Yeah,
English
yeah, yeah.
accent.
Which essentially is German or Teutonic, and Teutonic is what we use to refer to the Germanic more broadly. So like some of the British traditions would come under Teutonic, because it's essentially a catch-all for all of the Germanic peoples that spread out across Europe in the fifth, sixth, and seventh centuries. So the Angles, the Saxons, the Goths, the Vandals, all of those peoples that when the Huns invaded, left the Germanic areas in the Balkans and spread across Europe. That is what we think of when we say Teutonic. He basically, the whole concept, as I've just explained it, was all put together by Jacob Grimm. And this is what Hutton calls an impressive example of pioneering scholarly industry. And basically, yeah, he is the one that sort of condenses all of this mythology and finds the shared. This is obviously what they did with the Grimm's fairy tales. They find the shared, aspects between the different traditions to basically find like the overlaps and almost create like an origin myth.
Yeah,
And
and
yeah.
I know with a lot of the Grimm, well, most if not all of the Grimm fairy tales that they found, they would go out to different regions
Mm-hmm.
and speak to people, and it was very much kind of a writing down of an oral tradition. So I wonder
Mm-hmm.
if they also did that
Yeah.
with this, where they would base it on, in part, like what actual people were telling them?
Yeah. So, according to Hutton, Grimm assembled the basic body of material on which that concept was erected, the nocturnal processions, and identified the original mythology that inspired it as one of a nocturnal ride of dead heroes led by a pagan god and his female consort. And Hutton says it's actually Grimm who popularizes the term Wild Hunt. So it becomes known as the Wild Hunt in all of these different traditions. It's the Wild Jagd, I believe, in German. So essentially, Grimm names the phenomenon. So he gives the German name to all of these different phenomenons, and they all then become the Wild Hunt. So, according to Hutton, there was an element of nationalism and race that kind of characterized Grimm's original version. And he identifies Wotan, which is the Germanic version of Odin, so similar to Woden in the Britannic tradition. And he was quite interested in the militaristic aspects of it. But Hutton kind of notes that after sort of like the 1850s, that starts to shift. And as we've gotten into the 20th and the 21st century, that really changes. So Hutton essentially says that the modern conception, so what we would think of the hunt now, is a conflation of two different types of nocturnal processions. One of which was the more fey one that I spoke about at the beginning, that had female spirits that traveled about, that could be both a blessing and a curse. And that the other one is this monstrous, spectral, violent hunt. And Grimm sort of like, because he sort of mashed them together, that's now how we think of it. So that's why there's this real duality to the hunt, because it's essentially two different types of pagan tradition that have then gone through the funnel of Christianity and then come out the other end. And yeah, essentially, some historians think that they are like two different aspects of the same myth, whereas other historians think that they're two separate myths that have been homogenized, and then that's kind of been, the stamp, the seal was put on it essentially by Jacob Grimm. So I cannot think of anything that would tie it more into the Gothic tradition than the fact that Jacob Grimm is the one that gives it the name the Wild Hunt.
Yeah.
But there are a couple of, things. And I think particularly if we think about, writers like Tolkien, the early, progenitors of the fantasy genre in particular, that were using elements of folklore and mythology, but also using the conventions of the Gothic, particularly, I would say, like in the 19th century. But even if you think about maybe somebody going back further, like Spenser and the Faerie Queene, that's often classed as a chivalric romance, but it's much later, and it is actually almost like a final end stage homage to the earlier romances. And it's, all about like the Fae, and it's about Arthur. I think you can really see how that snowball that is the Gothic was running alongside something like this. And yeah, so not only was Theodoric the Great, king of the Ostrogoths, one of the potential leaders of the Wild Hunt, and certainly seems to have had some shared mythology, you also have that aspect of the allegory, and it being, the Wild Hunt being a sort of stand-in for real horrors that happened. And then, yeah, later on, you have somebody like the Brothers Grimm putting the stamp on it, and essentially Grimm is canonizing it in the same way that the Grimm's fairy tales canonized those version of the fairy tales. And God, we talked about that Ugly Stepsister film recently. The Brothers Grimm and the Grimm's fairy tales still have such a hold over the Gothic tradition, and I think that whilst maybe we're less aware of it and it's less obvious, this version of the Wild Hunt probably does too. So just a few places that the hunt has appeared in modernity, as I mentioned at the beginning. It is now being kind of reclaimed, and it exists in Wiccan and neo-pagan traditions. It also has appeared in Marvel's Marvel Comics Thor series. So if you have somehow managed to miss that over the last 15 years. Thor is a comic version of the Norse mythology Thor, and it's one of my favorite parts of the Marvel universe. And in the Thor comics, the Wild Hunt is led by Malkeith, who is one of the big bads in one of the Thor movies. So you might be familiar with Malkeith. He's a dark elf, which is really interesting as well because the Thor comics also do things like Ragnarok. So that's probably why I thought it was a Norse tradition and not a Germanic tradition, because I was just like, oh yeah, the Wild Hunt, like that's a Norse tradition. I know that because it's in a comic book. I will confess most of my knowledge of Norse mythology actually comes from
I
the
think
Thor
though
comics.
there is, aside other values, but this is one of the values of pop culture and literature and fiction and films and music and just all these kinds of things, is that
Yeah.
they can help to bring these other stories or traditions like to the attention of people who maybe wouldn't have
Yeah.
heard of them otherwise. So
Yeah, exactly. And I always end up Googling stuff after I read something like that. So,
yeah.
It also played a big role in the Hellboy comics. There's 2 story arcs in Mike Mignola's Hellboy comics. And potentially the most famous of the modern interpretations of the Wild Hunt is from The Witcher. So, The Witcher is a series of Polish books. They start out as short stories and then I think they become novels. They are a fantasy series about a sort of fantasy historical version of Eastern Europe. So, it is Slavic, it is partly Russian, it is also Germanic. So, it is kind of obviously it's not history, it's fantasy, but the time period it's sort of analog to would be kind of like 8th 9th century maybe. And it's about these people, they're witches, they go through a process that grants them powers that allows them to fight monsters. And it draws on a lot of Germanic and Nordic traditions, and essentially the Wild Hunt is a big bad. And the reason that you might know of it is because not only is it a series of books, it is also a series of games. And the 3rd game is called The Witcher 3, The Wild Hunt. And that game is all about the fact that the Wild Hunt, this strange otherworldly force that seems to have come from another realm, is going to appear and it's going to wreak disaster if they can't do something about it. And the reason that you might know about it specifically is because the 4th season of the Witcher TV series just dropped on Netflix. And that series draws very, very heavily on folklore, particularly the Polish tradition. I unfortunately probably will not be watching the 4th season of The Witcher because whilst Henry Cavill is quite a problematic person, I just can't watch Liam Hemsworth in that role. I'm sorry. Whoever put that wig on him did him damn dirty. So I shan't be watching it. So won't be finding out if the Wild Hunt pops up in the TV series. But that I would say is
So yeah,
probably
but
what's
you
catapulted.
dear listener, can let us know.
Yeah, let me know if I can just skip through the Liam Hemsworth scenes. I just want to know if Ciri and Yennefer are okay. But that's, I would say, probably. So I think The Witcher 3, I said 10 years earlier, but it's more than that now. I believe The Witcher 3 came out in 2013 or 2014. Because it was Game of the Year before Dragon Age Inquisition. I have not played The Witcher 3 because I am really shit at it. There's a bit quite near the beginning where you have to shoot a hippogriff, and I couldn't do it. But I have watched other people play it. And it's a great game. But I would say that's probably what really catapulted the Wild Hunt back into the pop culture imagination. And more recently, as of literally 2 months ago, it popped up in a game called Genshin Impact. And if you're a keen listener, you might have noticed that I have said before that I play Genshin Impact and I love Genshin Impact. And the reason I found this topic is because I was like, oh, the new area is based on, so like the new area basically is a precursor to an area that is heavily based on Russia. Each area in Genshin, each country is based on a certain region. So there's a place called Mondstadt that's based on like, Germany, Austria, but also kind of England, so the Germanic tradition. There's a place called Liyue that's inspired by China, and Izuma that's inspired by Japan, so on and so forth. This new area called Nordkrai is influenced heavily by Finland, Norway, and other parts of Scandinavia. And I was Googling one because there was it's meant to be cold, right? And there's a character called Lauma, and she's wearing next to nothing. And I was like, this is ridiculous fan service. But then I Googled it, and it turns out she's actually based on I think it's Finnish folklore. And the Laume, the figure, were actually these beautiful forest spirits who were naked and had big boobs. And I was like, well, now I can't be as mad about the fan service character who's nearly naked and has big boobs, because it's actually like accurate to the folklore in more ways than one. But the Wild Hunt, it was like one of the big kind of antagonists in this part of the game. So I was Googling the Wild Hunt, and then I saw this thing where it was like, the Wild Hunt, if you put it into Google, it'll be like, the leaders of the Wild Hunt have been imagined as Odin, Arthur, Gwynapnith, and Theodoric the Great. And I was like, what the fuck? Theodoric the Great? And we had literally just recorded the Gothic Wars episode, and I was like, what do you mean Theodoric the Great leads the Wild Hunt? I've never heard that. And then I did all this research, and that is how this episode has come to be.
Well, thank you so much, Lauren. And I know that I won't be alone in saying I'm glad that you played that game and then went on this rabbit hole of a Wild Hunt. I don't know if that's
it was a Wild Hunt.
Mixing metaphors, but yes, thank you so much. And this was so interesting.
Thank you, and
really fascinating.
It was a bit of a Wild Hunt because this is one of those areas where sources are a little bit difficult. So I did the academic research first, but then I do always like to look at like what is on Google. A lot of the stuff that was coming up, like obviously you've got a lot of folklore blogs and Celtic blogs, but then there was a lot of conservative, like the European conservative, and that's when I remembered that a lot of right-wing interest is in like the Norse tradition. So I did have to be quite careful about my cross-checking. So it was a little bit of a Wild Hunt, but also, dear listener, dear viewer, a bit of an insight into my brain and how I'll be sitting there playing a game and I'll be like, the Wild Hunt. And next thing you know, I've done pages and pages of research.
Wow.
But now I have somewhere to tell it. And that's how this happened. And everything is Gothic.
Everything is Gothic. And
what can I say?
What a wonderful place to end this episode, I think. So, yes. Thank you again so much, Lauren, for sharing with me your wonderful research.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening if you've made it this far. And until next time, stay safe and stay spooky.
Stay safe and stay spooky. Don't let the Wild Hunt catch you. Look out for Sir Francis Drake.